Hello everyone, welcome back. This is part two of our lecture on liberalism. We've just been talking about the difference between domestic liberalism and international liberalism, and how domestic liberalism has sort of moved on to this entire debate about whether we should have enablement or simply just sort of what we've been calling positive freedom. So positive versus negative freedom. Sorry, I got my terms wrong there. Enablement being positive freedom, negation of the power of government being negative freedom. And I wanted to just actually, very importantly, maybe just slash back to this for a second here. Just have a look at this term negative freedom. Isaiah Berlin did not mean that to mean like it's bad freedom. It's not. I just wanted to be very important, clear on this. I like to think about it, I find it helpful to think about it as negative freedom. That is the power to negate. Negate what, you might say? Well, to negate the power of government. Remember, what Locke was putting forward was a much more limited conception of government, where the people were governing themselves more, and government was involving itself in the process of government much less than in this sort of highly totalitarian type scenario that Hobbes was putting forward. So negative freedom, or the power to negate government through these rights, like having habeas corpus, Miranda rights. If you're arrested, you know what you're being accused with, charged with. Freedom of conscience, press, speech, property. So all very important there. But anyway, we're moving on to this new topic here concerning classical liberalism, and we've already suggested that classical liberalism is our sort of baseline theory for thinking about international relations. And so, how does liberalism, or idealism, as Cynthia Weber's been calling it, address or approach the international? Well, the first move is to, as Cynthia Weber suggests, is to open up the black box of the state. Now, we've earlier on talked about the state as being a sort of a billiard ball type construct, according to the neorealists. And what we lamented earlier on was the tendency of the neorealists to ignore what was going on inside the mind of the billiard ball, so to speak, and obviously to think about its domestic components. Now, this is very important. Neither realism nor neorealism really do that. Realism will, to a certain extent, think about first and second image questions. We know that much, but even realism tends to sort of assume that once the state is composed as an actor acting corporately, that it will remember the three S's. We said the three S's were common to both realism and neorealism. So realism is certainly interested in the mindset, if you will, or the cultural mindset of the state to a certain extent. If we're going that far, the classical realists are certainly interested in that, and the neorealists aren't, and those are for reasons that we've discussed. And I've suggested in class that it was probably to do with the Cold War and the fact that Waltz was an American theorist, and he didn't really want to have to sort of deal with this notion of there being no good guys, because realism doesn't see good guys and bad guys. It just sees, it just sees people acting. Excuse me, neorealism just sees people acting under the constraints of anarchy, whereas realism does see the tragedy and selfishness of human nature being involved. And of course, in a corporate actor sense, that selfish and tragic nature is the nature of the state. So the question then for the classical liberals is to try to see what difference it makes to go back to Waltz's levels or images of analysis, if you will, and start to think through whether or not there are things going on there that maybe the realists haven't really looked at. Let's have a look then at some of these principles that international liberalism puts forward. Well, first of all, we can say that liberals believe that bad behavior happens internationally not because people are evil, so it's not a human nature-based theory, and I guess in a way we're agreeing here with the neorealists, because the neorealists also refuse the temptation of saying that people have the sort of tendency to have bad nature or be selfish, avaricious, jealous, what have you. But that doesn't mean that the liberals disagree with the fully agree with the neorealists about their conclusions about the effect of anarchy. Rather, for them, anarchy is an institution. It's just an institution. And it's as such, it's something that's man-made and it can be controlled. So the second principle is that if we can change anarchy, then we can reduce the frequency of war. And I think what we're actually sort of suggesting here is not so much anarchy itself, but the effects of anarchy. By plowing into the fabric, if you will, of international life, institutions that look like domestic institutions, and this is our third principle, we can domesticate international life. To do that, we would need to increase our communication so that we're familiarizing ourselves with each other. This is point 4. And then concretizing those lines of communication in institutions. I think in this instance, literally bricks and mortar institutions, by the way, in order to sort of create a sense among the nation states of having what we call sunk costs. That is to say, resources committed and invested that the nation states are conscious of having committed and invested, that they don't want to lose their investment in down the road. So once those institutions are embedded and built, the nation states are sort of like, well, gee, that took millions of dollars to build. Do we really want to, blow this thing up or lose this thing just over the sake of a minor territorial dispute? So sunken costs are very relevant there. So we have on this slide, I think, a very interesting comparison between the liberal view of the world and Waltz's view of the world. And I'll just, for the sake of focus here, bring your attention to the second image that is the key aspect of liberalism's focus. So you remember that Waltz was suggesting that really, regardless of the nature of man, regardless of the character of society, at the end of the day, it was the international level that was the basic place where it was decided whether there would be war or not, because that is the location of what we call the permissive cause of anarchy. And anarchy is the variable here that makes all the difference. But if anarchy is just an institution, and we saw echoes of this, I think, in the realists' assessment, the pseudo-realist assessment that we put forward of Lord of the Flies to a certain extent. But if anarchy is just an institution, it can be present and not necessarily create warlike outcomes. And so the liberals are trying to track down why that might be so. And so the question for the liberals is which image you might want to look at to see whether or not wars are possible. And so for them, they believe a very strong argument can be made that liberal countries, that is to say countries that have liberal types of government already, are much less inclined to go to war with each other. People, after all, are rational. I've used the word good here. I think liberalism does believe that people are good, but most people are good at the end of the day. But the reason why, the specific reason why liberals think that people are good is because they are rational. So their image of goodness is premised on this idea of a reason or a rationality. Whereas, as we know, both realists and neorealists have dubious views on this, or they regard this as a dubious proposition. So from a realist perspective, of course, we know that human nature is awful. From a neorealist perspective, they just don't even think it's a factor because of the importance of anarchy. But liberals do believe that it is a factor. And so they bring in human nature as a variable where they want to argue that left to their own devices, human beings really don't like going to war, right? All they want to do, and this is going back to Locke, is kind of get on with what's going on in their patch of land, right? They just want to be playing the positive sum game of life, if you will. The second image of liberalism is then very important here, because in a certain type of government, that tendency of people to want to get on with their own affairs will be played up, right? It will have a higher role to play in shaping the outcomes that we're interested in here. So what types of government could conceivably play up that tendency for man to want to sort of get on with his own thing. Well, actually, a lot of the philosophers that we can look at will speak to this issue. But I want to focus on Immanuel Kant for just a moment, because he is generally regarded as being sort of the foremost exponent of this view, that it matters if countries are democratic or not. It matters for international peace whether countries are democratic or not. And democratic countries are much more likely to have positive relations with each other. Why? That's the question, and I'm going to explore that with you right now. So this is an image of Immanuel Kant. This slide contains a quote from Immanuel Kant, which I'll read out for you now. It's very important for our purposes. And it speaks to this question of why democracy matters, okay? If the consent of citizens is required in order to decide that war should be declared, then nothing is more natural than that they would be very cautious in commencing such a poor game, decreeing for themselves all the calamities of war. Among the latter would be having to fight, having to pay the costs of war from their own resources, having to painfully repair the devastation war leaves behind, and, to fill up the measure of evils, load themselves with heavy national debt that would embitter peace itself, that can never be liquidated on account of constant wars in the future. Well, those last few lines definitely make me think of a book that I read recently called The $4 Trillion War by Joe Stiglitz, which is about the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Since obviously 9/11, America's been cracking up quite a lot of debt, and will continue to crack up debt in the future, quite simply because of the cost of working with injured soldiers, both mentally and physically, as they try to recover from the impact of the war on their lives. Some of them, of course, will never recover because they have permanent injuries. But the question for Kant then is, and I suppose the question for us is, how right is Kant? Do people in democracies choose to go to war? Do democratic countries have an interest in wars of choice? Now, many liberals will actually disagree with Kant on this and say that actually there are occasions when democracies will engage in wars of choice because of corruption and various other things, and those liberals would be sort of modest liberals. I'm thinking of Chalmers Johnson here, for example, a man who died not that long ago, but he wrote a book called Nemesis, which was precisely about the tendency of liberal countries to have to fight. They don't just have liberalism, right? I was tongue-tied. Liberalism is not something you have, it's something you do, right? So it's something that you need to work hard to preserve, and that's very, very important. But what Kant is saying here, I think, as a broad sort of spectrum version of the baseline of how liberals approach the question of international relations, is very important, and it's a sort of an original statement, if you will. This idea that that democracies do not go to war with each other. And why? Because if we go back to our idea, as Locke would put it, most people just want to be left alone, right? And in a democracy, one of the advantages is that, well, you can be kind of left alone to govern yourself. And what is it that democracies have that other countries don't? Well, they have the ability for the common man to speak out, to vote, and to hold accountable those in power, unlike the Hobbesian model, which is more like a dictatorship, right? So liberal countries are countries where there are generally democratic habits and principles in the institutions of governance, and that gives people the right to, and the power to, the capacity to hold government to account. And so would people who have that power over government ever choose to go to war if they didn't have to, knowing the costs that they would have to pay? And Kant is saying, no way. The only reason people from a liberal country would ever go to war would be to fight a war that they had no choice in fighting. And what that means is that they would only go to war to fight countries that are not themselves liberal. So liberal democracies, in the modern parlance, only going to go to war with non-liberal countries. And this leads to today's liberals thinking about Kant and thinking about what he had to say, to ponder whether or not today with the apparent extending of the franchise of democracy across so many countries in the world today, that it's possible that we are entering into a new age of peace, because there aren't, in fact, many wars anymore in that sense, in that old sense of the term anyway. The older wars were the wars where countries declared war on each other. And if you've noticed that today we don't have country-on-country warfare that often anymore. We have wars in failed states. We have wars between the liberal West and the illiberal rest, you might say. And that's all well and good. But let's look at what the illiberal West often are fighting even amongst themselves. There are local wars, there are internal wars, internal ethnic strifes, that kind of thing. And generally they're to do with, and they're bound up with, the absence of Western-style mechanisms of governance. Our Western-style habits of governance might be more impressive or more adequate a term there. Western people seem to be in the culture of resolving their disputes through processes that we can recognize as having liberal heritage. So let's assess this thesis. Let's see what the contemporary liberals have to say. So first of all, before we do that, I want to just quickly pause and look at some three basic mechanisms that Kant suggests are central to this tendency of democratic countries to avoid wars with each other. There are three elements that he sort of puts his finger on. The first step towards peace is democratization. Now, we said that level 2 made a difference, didn't we? The second image. And here you see it. Kant uses the term Republican Constitution in order to speak about liberal regimes. And he does not mean Republican as in the Republican Party. What he means is Republican as in Republic. Now, what is a republic? A republic is not necessarily a democracy. A republic is a country wherein every member of that community is regarded as equal in the eyes of the law. In other words, there's nobody that is immune to the sanction of the law. No king, no queen can be held unaccountable. So if somebody murders someone, doesn't matter who they are, they have legitimately cause to worry that they might be brought to court, right? So as we've said before, in that sort of situation where the people can hold the leaders to account through courts or through the sanction of an election, only popular wars will be possible. So that's certainly a domestic limitation that involves, I guess, both first and second image. But most importantly, I think, if we're remembering our conversation last week about permissive causes, the second image would be very important there. Now, the second image here, the second point that we want to raise is more about the condition of the international sphere, and that is the question of the Pacific Federation. When liberal democracies come into contact with each other on the international stage, over time they come to recognize each other as exactly that, as liberal democracies. And they begin to realize that there is an added advantage in their forming relationships with each other, which will prevent any reduction in their cooperation down the road. So they want to lock in what they call collective security, a sort of a contract, if you will, between liberal nations. Now, obviously, first of all, this could be in the form of like a security contract with each other. You know, if somebody starts hitting you around, I'll come help, and vice versa. If someone starts knocking me around, you're going to come and help. So we see the beginning of a Pacific Federation there. But Kant is clever here. He also suggests that once this security contract is established, that it's not just an alliance in the military sense, because what happens is that the citizens of those countries interacting with each other, cooperating with each other, perhaps trading with each other, as we'll see now in point 3 in a minute, but I'm jumping ahead. They're going to start to see each other's consensuality. That means they're going to be starting to become aware of each other as liberal citizens who have no particular grudge against them, but only want to take care of their own patch of land. So the theory would be that as that applies today, throughout the Western world with interactions of globalization going on, we start to see that people from America, Canada, Japan, Ireland, Australia, all kind of start to regard each other as consensual, and that's very important, right? And so I've already spoken about it a little bit, but just to sort of reiterate the third point here, universal hospitality, a right of access, opportunity for free exchange of goods and ideas. Now that solves the material dilemma, of course, which is that, well, what do you do when country A needs stuff that it doesn't have? Is it going to go to war to try to take over the other country's stuff? No, because of universal hospitality and what we today call free trade, that problem is resolved. And so Kant is very intelligently there, I think, suggesting that in a way, the costs of war being so grave as they are, why would you go to war when you can trade your way towards resolving your material disputes? I think that's a really, really important point for us. So there you go. There's three sort of dynamics or three articles of Kant's argument in favor of perpetual peace. And he believes that once that happens, then you can enshrine sort of a type of international law, and we'll just put that up here on the screen here, because the person who excuse me, the person who seems to have been most sort of central to popularizing this Kantian impulse was someone who genuinely did believe in international law, and that was Woodrow Wilson, who famously, President Woodrow Wilson said that he was entering World War I, taking America into World War I. Why? In order to make the world safe for democracy. So Woodrow Wilson then, on the eve of the war, clearly someone who believed in a lot of this Kantian idealism. Our object now, he says, as then, is to vindicate the principles of peace and justice in the life of the world, as against selfish and autocratic power, and to set up among the really free and self-governed people of the world such a concert of purpose, such a unity of purpose and of action, as will henceforth ensure the observance of those principles. Clearly, this is someone who believes that the more liberal countries there are, the safer freedom will be. And so by spreading liberal democracy, everyone will benefit. And the question is, I suppose, how true is this argument? Woodrow Wilson may be onto something when we think about the fact that, indeed, there's very little war between liberal countries. There's some minor examples, in fact, but between liberal nation states, wars have not taken place that often. Now, some people would challenge that, and they would say, well, what about Serbia and the attack against Serbia during the Kosovo campaign? That is not a bad point. This was in the late 90s. Some of you may remember it. But there, in fact, there was a coalition of Western countries, all democracies, attacking another country, which itself actually happened to be a democracy. Now, some people would say it was practicing illiberal practices, and that's perhaps fine. But so certainly, I think there's general truth to the idea of a liberal zone of peace, but there are specific cases where we can see perhaps that the argument falls a little thin in certain limited instances, and perhaps those limited instances are instructive. Some people would say, well, the exception proves the rule, doesn't it? If you're satisfied with that, then that's fine. But certainly you can see how these Kantian principles have changed the relationships between nation-states historically. And I said at the start of the lecture that history was important here, not just the idea of a positive sum game, but the idea of history and historical transformation and the encroachment and the spreading of habits of democracy. Just look at how United States and British relations have changed over the years. They went from being seriously sort of opposed to each other, enemies, to, over time, as Britain actually became democratic with the Reform Act of 1832, a lot of Britain's imperial ambitions started to be held in check. The Reform Act of 1832, by the way, was an act that was designed to take effectual measures for correcting diverse abuses that have long prevailed in the choice of members to serve in the Commons House of Parliament. I don't know if you know much about British history or not, but basically what this means is that at the time, Britain still had what was called rotten boroughs, which were basically electoral districts that were really small, maybe ruling over just a tiny village or something, and the local lord or gentry would easily tie up that election and get himself a place in Parliament. And of course, you know, other constituencies would have much more people and would have a much more vitriolic election. So with members of Parliament represented from these very tiny districts, they were unaccountable in public. They could buy off their local voters quite easily, and it is said that this was a great source of corruption in British politics. But if you see from 1832 onwards with the Reform Act, we see a very different Britain. In fact, a Britain eventually allying itself with America in order to fight illiberal Germany twice in history. So that does beg the question about whether that process that we're talking about has some merits to it. So do we have a Pacific Union today? I wanted to show you this slide because I think it's very important. You can see here two different blue shades on the map, and they give us a very clear impression of the spread of democracy over the years. The dark blue are the original sort of democracies from the turn of the last century, and you can see there's a few of them there, all right. Over time, however, the light blue has clearly spread quite far. And we've seen that by the year 2000, that's 100 years later, a huge spreading of democracy all around the world. Now, there are certainly some setbacks along the way here, that's to be sure. But by and large, the process has held intact. And despite the challenges, we seem to be living in an increasingly democratic age, where elections are the norm. And you can see even, you know, since 2000, the possibility emerging that some other countries will be able to shift towards democracy soon, because we've had revolts in Egypt and Tunisia, and the jury is still out as to what the long-term impact of those revolts will be. But I personally feel somewhat confident that that the virus, if you will, of democratic institutional spreading to these countries is very much for real, and I think it's very important for that area. I also think that you can perhaps see potential for change in Cuba sometime in the next 10 years. North Korea, I'm not so sure about, because obviously that's a very hard case, but it's possible, and who knows. But certainly that Middle Eastern democracy is a very important thing. Which leads us to a question like, how has this changed this culture? You were talking about history before. And I just wanted to sort of put up this slide here because it speaks kind of rather brashly to the kind of way that we regard democracy today. And indeed, John Candy's Canadian Bacon here sort of shows, after all, that the very idea of Canada and the United States going to war someday is a bit of a joke, right? That idea has become so embedded in our heads. We're so familiar with each other now. The idea of Canadians being slightly strange maybe, but otherwise consensual people, to use that Kantian idiom, is very much embedded in our heads now. Same as we could not possibly imagine going to war with Britain, even though Britain has, you know, and Canada has as well, you know, a fairly serious army and would be capable of doing some damage to the United States. So from a realist perspective, the worry would be, as we've said before, relative gains. That is the idea of the zero-sum scenario where my win is your loss, and that the security pie, if you will, doesn't really grow. But from a Kantian perspective, and again we've said, echoing John McCain in his first in his election run there against Obama in Obama's first election, we heard John McCain talking about growing the pie, and here is the idea of a positive sum scenario where absolute gains are the name of the day. And so Kantian theorists would be quite aware that this sort of a tendency of people just to sort of want to be left alone to their own devices is the most important thing. Canadians don't really worry about being better than America, or richer than America, or more militarily enabled than America, or empowered. They just want to be able to get on with their own thing. So this is a classic case of the idea of absolute gains being of importance here. And then, of course, you have the values question, which is the sort of second image question as we've been talking about it. The idea that once Canadians and Americans recognize in each other's basic fundamental commitments to the same institutional values, there's no need for violence between those two countries. And so, obviously, John Candy's movie is a comedy for that reason, because it's just such a ridiculous idea. Now, I mentioned here at the bottom of the slide Adam Smith's approach to liberalism, which is a little bit different because he was more of an economist, and he would sort of come at it more from an economic interdependence point of view. I just want you to keep that in mind. I don't really want to focus on Adam Smith for this lecture, but I do want to sort of urge you to keep his name in mind and his idea of interdependence in mind as we move forward. So just quickly now, we'll move through the last few slides, I think, very quickly because we're running out of time. But realism's timeless truth, we've talked about realism as being timelessly true in the past, and that seemed to fail in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I wanted to mention that because I think it's important for us to think about. It was at this time that the great hostility that neorealism especially seemed to sort of imagine would continue, regardless of whether Russia was communist or Islamist or democratic, right? Because neorealists were saying that it didn't matter what was going on inside the billiard balls, of course. But once the billiard balls in the Eastern European sphere and in the Russian sphere changed and became more democratic, a lot of them anyway, especially in the Eastern European area, we saw a rapid spread of democracy. And what we saw, very interestingly, was a huge change in the momentum of Western values, and democratic values, and commitments to peaceful solutions to international conflict spreading around the world. We've talked in that last image there with the map about the spread of democracy. We saw new arms control agreements. And we saw other things, like, for example, the ability to handle on a global basis the ozone hole, for example. So clearly, international legislation, commitments to reducing arms, commitments to defending the nations from other types of security issues, like, for example, from the environment, all of these became germane after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, the question is, would realism be able to explain this? Apparently it wasn't. Realism would rather, I think, have predicted instead that after the end of the Cold War, all the non-superpower states left would have come together to try to balance out the United States. The United States basically being the only superpower left on the planet. It would have stood to reason, or would have made sense, that the United States would have sort of found itself in the situation that Athens was in during the Peloponnesian War, and we talked about that during the realism sessions. But America did not find itself surrounded by powers that were willing to nip at its heels. Instead, globalization became the nom de jour. And it seems that this absolute gains tendency, as opposed to relative gains tendency that realism identifies, became the name of the game. So that's very interesting for us. And it suggests that even today there's a lot of evidence of international cooperation. So, do we live then in a new world order? I'll move through this slide very quickly, but the question we will be thinking about as we prepare our minds to watch the movie Independence Day, which is the next movie that Cynthia Weber takes us through, is this one. Do we live in a new world order? Has there been a sort of a horizontalization of international politics as democracy has broken out everywhere? We don't need an international government. All we need is international institutions that allow for communication horizontally between the constituent liberal nation states of the planet. Certainly, indeed, for many, the Cold War was the birth of a true international society in that sense. After all, democracies were promoting democracy in autocratic states. They were actively going out there into the third world and the lesser democratic world trying to promote democracy. But also, secondly, the global communications revolution seemed to be stimulating greater familiarity and greater consensuality among the nation states, and I think that's really important for us as well. We remember that Kantian term, consensuality, right? Now, at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, a gentleman that's still alive, a very clever scholar by the name of Francis Fukuyama, who was George Bush Sr.'s foreign policy advisor, he said the question is whether we can now imagine, because of this spreading of democracy, whether we are not now at a point in time where there's no apparent or obvious way in which the future will represent a fundamental improvement over our current order. If so, then we must take into consideration the possibility that history with a capital H, now note that, itself might be at an end. Right? Why would Fukuyama be arguing that history itself might be at an end? Well, basically because he's saying it's all over but the shouting. If democracies are promoting democracy overseas, and the global communications revolution through fax machines and telecommunications, computers, cell phones, it seems to be spreading our familiarity. We have global satellite television news now. We can watch Al Jazeera, they can watch CNN. So perhaps we are sort of at a point in time, says Fukuyama, in a way, predicting then what seems to be even more apparent now with the Egyptian revolt. And as some of us may know, if you've been following the Egyptian revolt, you know that Facebook and Twitter and all these things were really, really important, because the people in Egypt were able to see, some would say, able to see how much freedom of speech Western people have, and they were seizing and taking that freedom of speech for themselves, and that's really hugely important. And I know the process in Egypt is not yet concluded, but I'm very much of a mind that it will continue to function, and that revolt will continue until Egypt looks something much more like a Western-style democracy. Of course, it may look something more like Turkey, which is more likely, I suppose, at the end of the day. Turkey is a different kind of a democracy, I suppose. It is a democracy, but it is uniquely a sort of an Eastern or Islamist-style democracy, and you know, that's fine. There's no reason to think that an Islamic democracy would not be able to take its place with the other liberal democracies of the world, because many of those effects that Kant was discussing would still carry on. The familiar, the consensuality effect, for example, over the long term would be very, very real, I think. So do we live then, perhaps now today, perhaps more than ever, in the world that Kant, that Woodrow Wilson was dreaming of? Arguably, for some people, we do. And so our case study writer for this week is Charles Kegley, and he is putting forward the idea that we live in a new world order. This is Cynthia Weber's focus of attention. You'll see the quote from him on page 45, and I also have the excerpt from him available for you on Blackboard. People matter, public sentiment is captured instantaneously in our age of global communications, knit together by cables, the airwaves, and the fax machine. The distinction between domestic and foreign affairs is broken down. This also follows Wilson's belief that lowering barriers between countries could be a barrier to warfare. So clearly Kegley convinced that this order makes a difference, that we've entered into a horizontal age where what we're looking at is a sort of a parliament of nations knit together by this dense fabric of cables, airways, and the fax machine. And so, as we prepare our minds to think and reflect on the movie we're going to watch, keep this quote in mind. Ask yourselves as you're watching Independence Day, and we'll start playing it the next day we meet. Ask yourself as you're watching Independence Day whether this movie reflects this horizontalism among nations. Does it truly show the liberal ideal, or is it not still the case that power is still somewhat vertical, and that we live in a world where perhaps some nations are more equal than others? Okay, so that's the end of the lecture for today anyway. We'll have a few more slides the next day we meet, just to sort of patch together bits and pieces of the film as we're watching it. I'll have some slides for you there, but that is the formal lecture part of this session over. Thank you very much, and I'll see you the next day for Independence Day.